Hello, everyone. This video is the diaphragm and intercostals. So we're really talking about muscles of respiration. Let's get started. I'm going to go right into the screen share. Uh-oh. There we are. Sometimes I click a little too fast and I click the wrong thing. Okay, so the diaphragm is a skeletal muscle, even though it is also arguably the most important muscle in the body because if it doesn't move, you don't breathe. So the diaphragm is the primary muscle of respiration. And as it is a skeletal muscle, it does have origin and insertion. So let's take a look at really how this muscle is situated in the body. It is up under the ribs and it forms kind of an umbrella shape. I go into the visible body here. I'm going to make that a little bit smaller. I'm going to turn him like this. Okay. So you can see if you were looking straight up underneath the diaphragm, this is what it would look like. It fills the entire thoracic cavity. And in fact, it is the division between the thoracic cavity and the abdominal cavity. Okay, so if I turn them back up like this, all of this in here would be thoracic cavity. All of this down here would be abdominal cavity. So it makes a physical division between the two cavities. Now, as you can see, right here, I'm going to light it up. There we go. You can see that there is a central tendon here to the diaphragm. If I move it around, you can see the rest of the diaphragm. And again, if I turn it all different ways, you can see how the diaphragm sits in here. But this is the central tendon of the diaphragm, and it attaches directly to the vertebrae, okay? And you can't see all of that in this picture. All right, so the central tendon of the diaphragm starts up here and then kind of goes through the middle of it and then attaches to the vertebrae, right? So that's the central tendon of the diaphragm, and that's the insertion of this muscle, but it does attach to the skeleton. So I wanted you to see how that occurs. All right, so as far as origins are concerned, we have a couple because of the way that it makes that umbrella shape up underneath the rib cage. So we have a costal attachment, that's the ribs. So inner surface of lower 6 ribs. We have a lumbar attachment, so that's upper 2 or 3 lumbar vertebrae, so that's on the posterior. And then we have a sternal attachment. So on the posterior side, or internal surface really, of the sternum, we have the inner part of the xiphoid process where it attaches as well, okay? Now, in order to inhale, the central tendon has to draw down, okay? And what that does then is it increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. And when you increase the volume of the thoracic cavity, air is automatically drawn into the lungs. Now, this is something we will talk about more in depth when we get to the respiratory system and physiology, the function and how all of that occurs. But it is actually inhalation that draws that umbrella down a little bit, increasing the volume in the thoracic cavity, which automatically draws air into the lungs. It's a vacuum in there. So in order for us to breathe, we have to change the volume within the thoracic cavity. And moving the diaphragm down a tiny bit is how we do that. So the contraction of the diaphragm draws down that central tendon, only about a ½ inch, it's not very far, and increases the volume of the thoracic cavity during inhalation. Now, the thing is though, once you're done inhaling, all you do is relax the diaphragm and you automatically exhale. Exhalation is actually a passive action. You don't really have to do anything to exhale. It's inhalation that is the action that the diaphragm provides, okay? Exhalation is just relaxation of the diaphragm, and then it repositions itself, okay? So inhalation, the diaphragm draws down on the central tendon. Exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes, okay? Now, if you involuntarily draw down on that central tendon, it causes air to rush into the lungs and your vocal cords snap shut, and that is a hiccup. The noise that is caused by those vocal cords snapping shut all of a sudden is what you hear when somebody goes, eh. That's the sound of a hiccup. So that is an involuntary contraction of the diaphragm, or essentially a twitch of the diaphragm, okay? Which is kind of fun. Now, the nerve that controls the diaphragm is called the phrenic nerve. And that is very, very important, because if the phrenic nerve isn't working, you don't breathe properly. So know that nerve. So here's another inferior view of the diaphragm, okay? Here's that central tendon again. There's all of the muscle fiber attaching to the interior ribs and the interior sternum. But you'll notice that within the diaphragm itself, you have a hiatus or two. You really do. Because remember, it is the division between the thoracic and abdominal cavities, but you have structures that go through there, specifically the esophagus, which would be right here, as this is the esophageal hiatus. The esophagus is your food tube. You have the vena cava, and you have the aorta. So the aorta is, at this point, is called the abdominal aorta because it's now in the abdomen. But the aorta is the largest artery in the body, and it's very important because all the branches off of the aorta supply the body with blood, fresh oxygenated blood. So we have to have a hole in the diaphragm through which the aorta can travel, and we do. And this one over here is for the vena cava. As I mentioned, that's the largest vein in the body. So the vena cava takes deoxygenated blood back up to the heart to then send it through the cycle again, okay? And like I said, we'll talk about all this in physiology, how all that works. Right now, we're just really more concerned about the muscles. Okay, so look, giving you an idea of where this sits. Here's the lumbar vertebrae. This is QL right here, and this is psoas major. So the inferior portion of the diaphragm is actually quite low as it sits on the lumbar vertebrae. The superior portion is way up in the ribs here. This is palpable, but only out here, sort of near the external, I don't know, 8th, 9th, and 10th ribs, where you can actually get your fingers up underneath the rib cage. If you bend forward and curl your fingers in, that's really the only place that you can get to the diaphragm, because obviously all of the other places are either inaccessible because they're just too interior, or they're covered by, you have to go through guts to get to some of the other stuff. So we can palpate just the external outer portion right in here and right in here, okay? And you're probably thinking, well, why would we need to massage the diaphragm? That's a really good question. For people with breathing issues like asthma, emphysema, COPD, etc., maybe long-term COVID now, I guess, is going to be on that list, or long-haul COVID symptoms. It is difficult to breathe on a regular basis, which means that you are asking your respiratory muscles to take over a lot more than the average person, okay? is going to require more action of this muscle. And sometimes these muscles, and in particular the diaphragm, do get tight or tense, or I'm going to say locked up in there. And it feels really good to have those muscles addressed so that breathing can be more free. All right. It actually feels better to breathe once you have your diaphragm worked on a little bit. And I know because I'm an asthmatic, but even if you're not, it actually still feels a little bit different. You feel like you can take a deeper breath once you've had a little bit of diaphragm work done. So that is why you would work the diaphragm. Now, I said breathing muscles, right? Muscles of respiration. So we are now going to talk about the intercostals, which is on page 215. So we'll go right back in here. I'm actually going to go to visible body here. So these are the intercostals. Inter means between. Costal, of course, means ribs. So, these are the external intercostals. These are the internal intercostals. And they actually run in opposite directions, just like the internal and external obliques. And you can see those lovely fiber directions. They're the same as the obliques. So the external intercostals are like hands in your pockets. Internal intercostals are like hands across your heart. Okay. So let's go back to the book here. Go to 215. Here we are. Internal intercostals and external intercostals. See? Incidentally, these muscles are in between the ribs, right? And other animals have them too. So if you like to eat spare ribs or short ribs or any ribs at all, you are eating intercostal muscle. Now that's a thing, you know. Happy lunch, everybody. Okay. So the external intercostals obviously are more superficial. And really both of them originate on the superior border of the rib below and then insert on the inferior border of the rib above. So again, we're just going one rib to one rib. That's it. It's the fiber direction that's going to determine what it does to those ribs. So the external intercostals draw the ribs up and out, okay, superiorly. So external intercostals help with inhalation, drawing those ribs up and out, increasing the space within the thoracic cavity. So it's pulling the ribs up, increasing the space in the thoracic cavity, assisting with the inhalation, okay? You can see that they're going to pull those ribs up and out in this direction. Now, the internal intercostals, they are going to push the ribs down and in, or not push, pull the ribs down and in. And you can see that with these fiber directions, we're going this way. So the internal intercostals, if they are drawing the ribs inferiorly, they are going to squoosh the thoracic cavity and force air out of the lungs. So these help with exhalation. More specifically, forced exhalation, okay? If you put your fingers in between your ribs, if you can feel in between your ribs, probably right around 7, 8, or 9 is where you're going to be able to feel them the most. And you forcefully exhale. You can feel internal intercostals contract. If you put your fingers there and take a deep breath in, you can feel the external intercostals, but I'll tell you what, the stronger contraction is actually that forced exhalation with the internal intercostals. You can feel those contract and actually push against your fingers a little bit. So again, these intercostal muscles are muscles of respiration. That is all they do. They assist with either inhalation or exhalation. So they work directly with the diaphragm to change the volume of the thoracic cavity and allows you to breathe. Yay. And obviously these are palpable because we just did that. You can feel them right in between your ribs. If you ever get a stitch in your side when you're running, right? That's actually intercostal muscle for the most part. Sometimes it's not, but a lot of times it is intercostal muscle. And it's just like a little spasm of an intercostal. And yeah, it hurts. But it's because of all that activity, right? Inhaling and exhaling. You're forcing those to work. All right. That's it for those muscles of respiration, diaphragm and intercostals.